In 1911, two guano miners were harvesting the substance in the cave, extracting many tons of black guano. They also stumbled across items of interest and threw everything that wasn't in the dump site outside of the cave. It wasn't until 1912 and subsequent decades that the cave would be excavated, as the items made their way to archaeologists and collectors who identified the cultural significance of this site that is Lovelock Cave. Perhaps the most famous myth that was attributed to the site when the bodies were discovered was that of Sarah Winnemucca, the daughter of a Paiute chief, who in the late 19th century wrote about a legend of some red-haired giants whom they called the Siteka, or Tule Eaters, that would torment the ancestors of the Paiute, capturing some and cannibalizing them. The Paiutes had enough and then fought against them. They were successful and were able to corner the remainder of the Siteka into what would become Lovelock Cave. However, they put up a fierce resistance, repelling them with bows, so the Paiutes gathered brush and placed it on the mouth of the cave, which was then set alight, killing the giants. The bodies that were recovered in the dig were sensationalized by the press as being the remains of the red-haired giants that terrorized man in ancient times. Yet this story has overshadowed the actual findings that were uncovered during the archaeological digs of the site. Today, when looking up the history of the cave, the legend of these red-haired giants are given the spotlight alongside many conspiracies of a lost race of giants that once roamed the earth. The purpose of this film is to get to the truth of the items and their remains found in Lovelock Cave and piece together the evidence of how this culture lived and thrived in a prehistoric Nevada that was much different in those days. The first excavations in 1912 uncovered bowl-shaped depressions that were 2 to 5 feet deep and 5 to 10 feet in diameter. These were identified as cache pits due to how they were lined with reeds and grasses and containing many different types of artifacts, ranging from foodstuffs, which was known as more than likely being cleaned and the lining replaced after every use, to items that must have held important significance in their culture, running from those used for daily needs and hunting to some that may have held a religious or ritualistic significance. One of the most notable finds was in the cache known as Pit 12. Originally believed to have been only 2 foot 5 inches deep, it was neatly arranged and lined, with down covering a reed mat that was supposed to be the bottom. However, it was a false bottom, and when the mat was removed, underneath in the bundle were 11 beautifully made duck decoys, created from rushes and feathers, and painted to look like a real duck. There was also a rush bag full of feathers wrapped in a mat, feathers tied with string, and 2 bundles of snares made of strings and twigs. It was speculated these decoys were left by a hunter who hid them until it was time for the next waterfowl hunting season. Another notable cache was Pit 31, on the southwest end of the cave, 8 feet 9 inches deep, with a diameter of 5 feet and 4 foot 4 inches, with no lining, that contained hundreds of feathers belonging to large birds such as eagles and pelicans, attached to cordage made of rushes. There was also a bone awl, a bone implement with 2 perforations, and a bone carving in the form of a snake. These contents are believed to have been prayer plumes left as an offering in the cache, or used as part of a shaman's equipment for healing the sick, as was observed in use by the modern Paiute of the region. Eagle feathers tied to cords. Throughout the excavations of Lovelock Cave, only about 45 graves were found. Because of the arid climate and dryness of the cave, many of the bodies in these graves were preserved alongside the artifacts they were interred with. The first grave that was excavated was in the back of the cave, buried at a depth of 6 foot 3 inches. The remains were missing the head and legs, but they contained what appeared to be an apron-like garment made with worn-out netting that was dyed red. This was what confirmed the remains to be that of a woman. Next to the skirt were found short strands of olivella shell beads that ended with a deer hoof. 200 square shell beads were also found, all burnt, and one attached to a basket fragment, which associated the burial to an earlier occupation of the cave, as well as the fact there was a cache pit on top of the remains. Many other burials contained mummies, as well as artifacts such as rabbit skin blankets, coiled baskets, netting, lithics, and horned artifacts to name a few. Some of the remains were also scavenged by animals such as coyotes, a coprolite which contained an undigested strand of shell beads. Although many of the remains were found to have gone through some sort of fire post-mortem, none of them were described as giant or having red hair, and only a few broken bones were the only evidence of any sort of cannibalism occurring, probably to extract bone marrow during a time of great famine. Radiocarbon dating on some of the tissues and bones has placed the age of the burials at around the mid to late 1400s BC. The 1924 excavation of the cave also revealed more notable and unique artifacts that added more evidence of who these peoples were. Many weapons they used for hunting and maybe in warfare were found. Notable were large fragments of spear throwers. No complete ones were ever excavated, although there is a story that the original guano miners discovered a complete spear thrower, but it was sold to a collector after whose death it was lost. The spear thrower fragments were also accompanied with the foreshafts of the darts, unfletched, but even the foreshafts intact, with the lithics still attached. Some of these were also found with blunt points, possibly used for practice or to stun. They are said to somewhat resemble those made by the basket maker peoples, centered around Utah and eastern Nevada. This includes crooked clubs that bear a resemblance to those made by them as well. A sling was also found, created with a unique weave. Later, stratigraphic excavation also revealed a 7-inch fragment of a bow made of mountain cedar, resembling those made by the northern Paiute of the region. And lastly, a very interesting find were some quote-unquote fire arrow foreshafts, points that were wrapped in grass, reeds, or rotten wood that would have been lighted alongside many lithics, which will be looked at later in the film, as this may mean something very important occurred in this cave. Horn artifacts are also notable artifacts found in Lovelock Cave, especially amongst the older layers in the cave. There were caches of horns and antlers belonging to bighorn sheep and pronghorn antelope. Some of the former were carved into what were called quote-unquote sickles, one of which measured 13 inches in length and half an inch in thickness. A similar object was found in the basket maker site. Although they are called sickles, it is more probable they were used in the creation of cordage or in bark shredding. Many of the horn artifacts were incised or carved to form effigies. Returning to the subject of duck decoys, 2 forms were identified: painted and stuffed. 25 to 30 tule reeds were bound together, shaped, and then cut to create the tail. The head was also crafted and bound with rushes, then attached through a stud on the body and sewn together. Sometimes they would be wrapped in duckskin and real beaks, which were found in the cave. The head, breast, and tail were painted. There seems to have been a spot to tie cordage on the breast of the duck decoy that may have been used as an anchor. This wasn't the only quote-unquote taxidermy work the peoples of Lovelock Cave did. There was also evidence that found those of the later period used bird heads on bodies made of rushes, a lot smaller than the ducks, as decoys that were placed in snares. Also found was a ceremonial plume centered around the arm bone of a bird, possibly a pelican, 20 inches long. Quills as well as large feathers are wrapped and twisted around it, bunched in with smaller feathers and the iridescent green feathers of a male mallard duck. Down feathers are also on the tips of the large feathers. This is all wrapped in the bottom with a 6-inch piece of bobcat fur. On one of the smaller feathers is a twisted small cord of Olivella snail shells. It was encased in the skin of a young bobcat. The purpose of this item was believed to have been a sort of wand used in rituals by a shaman. Notable to mention, as well, were the many wicker items and baskets with simple but well-crafted geometric designs that most closely resemble those made by the peoples of Mono Lake. When it comes to footwear, woven sandals were also found, as well as moccasins. Blankets were found on some of the bodies, which were made of bird and rodent skins that were twisted together. Lovelock Cave is believed to have first been used as a rock shelter, being on the shores of ancient Lake Lahontan. It used to be marshy, making the cave a prime spot to live in, given how close it was to many of their foodstuffs. It went through different periods of use, as is seen by the cache pits placed on top of the older burials. It may have been used primarily as a shelter to live in, and an area for storage, only occasionally used as a burial place, and maybe a ceremonial site. This does not mean the peoples who lived there had or didn't have an aversion to living in an area used to bury the dead, but from their perspective, with all the time between the burials and habitation, there was nothing to suggest it was used for any funerary purpose. Therefore, the peoples lived and stored their items in the cave. The oldest material, a basket fragment, has been dated to 1218 BC, the cave being in use ever since. Now the biggest question remains, who were these people? It has been hypothesized that they were an offshoot of the basket maker culture, based on a small similarity in the objects that are found, such as basketry and spear throwers, as well as the horn sickles. Yet the people of Lovelock Cave showed no evidence of agricultural practices, rather being hunter-gatherers, unlike the basket maker people. It is therefore speculated that the Lovelock Cave culture and the basket makers may have originated from a common group known as the Basic Southwest, and diverged at some recent point. Based on the Olivella snail shells, they were interconnected in trade with the coastal peoples of the Pacific. By 1000 AD, the climate began to dry, resources became less abundant, as the marshland began to dry. It is possible they had to resort to cannibalism, as was seen in the broken bones found in the cave that were extracted for their marrow. A new people arrived in the area, likely due to the aforementioned climate changes, who used the bow, as was evident in the fragments found in the cave. These may have been the ancestors of the Paiute people of the area today. It may have been that they fought with the original inhabitants of the cave, as evidence of a great fire, as well as the previously mentioned fire arrow foreshafts that were found. The placement of many lithics at the entrance of the cave led to speculation that they were shot into the cave. Is this proof of the legends about how the Paiutes besieged the peoples of Lovelock Cave and burned it? Could it have been that in their battles against the Lovelock peoples, they decided to destroy their last refuge, or noticing the caches and burials, saw it as strategic to burn their provisions while also desecrating what they perceived to be a sacred space? We may never know the details of what happened to the Lovelock peoples, but afterwards in the area, evidence of the historic Paiutes appears afterwards, and the cave would be used well into historic times. It is important to remember that behind every tall tale, there is always a kernel of truth to the story, as is the case with the real story behind the Lovelock Cave culture. These were a people who first appeared in an area that was abundant and teeming with life, as was shown in how they used the resources at their disposal in the amazing artifacts that were preserved. However, the climate began to fluctuate, which did not take kindly to the people who only knew abundance. A new group of people arrived, and conflict may have arisen, that saw the eradication of the previous group, and this new group preserving the memory of the Lovelock people as a race of cannibalistic giants.